offspring fitness. This is the first time anyone has shown in a healthy population of wild animals that there's such direct effects on offspring fitness. So the question is how is malcomposition acting on offspring independent of their effects just on overall size? Or maybe fat. And we have a couple different ideas that it would really be lovely to follow up on at some point. So first off, we know in hibernators that they must consume polyunsaturated fatty acids in order to survive hibernation. And it's entirely possible that when young are consuming a higher fat milk, they're getting more of these essential polyunsaturated fatty acids. The other hypothesis we have is it's been shown in primates when young consume a higher fat, or I should say a higher energy milk, they are more active at weaning. And if that's also true for Colombian ground squirrels, maybe these young just are eating more than their counterparts in that short period between weaning and okay, so now I'm going to move on to some of our work looking at calcium metabolism during regrowth. Okay, so during pregnancy and lactation, mothers are supplying their offspring with the nutrients they need for growth and development. And among the tissues that mothers must support the production of is offspring bone. So this results in quite a large amount of calcium transfer that occurs during this period of time. And in most species, it's primarily occurring during lactation. Relatively little bone ossification tends to occur during pregnancy. So how do females meet the high demand of transferring sufficient calcium to their young? Well, they can eat more food. If you eat more, you're going to take in a bit more calcium. But we also know that many species will seek out calcium-rich resources to augment their intake. And I think one of the most fascinating things is we also know in nearly all of the species that have been studied to date, mothers also mobilize mineral from their own skeleton. So if you think about this, that's pretty risky business. If you're losing mineral from your skeleton, that's going to decrease your bone mineral density and potentially will impact your risk of fracture and so forth. Okay, so I also think there's some reasons to believe that small mammals are particularly likely to be limited by calcium availability during lactation. First off, small species tend to specialize on low calcium diets. So we know that rodents, many of which are carnivorous, we have bats that are frugivorous or insectivorous. When we look at the calcium content of these items, it tends to be lower than that of the leafy material consumed by an herbivore or the animal material consumed by a carnivore. Also important when we're looking at small species is that we do find many small mammals that have quite large litter sizes. And as it turns out, there seems to be constraints on food intake with litter size. So Hammond and Diamond described the relationship between litter size and food intake in mice and found that as litter size went up, so did food intake, but then it plateaued. So mothers that have more than 8 offspring are unable to eat any more food in order to meet the increased demand. So you can imagine here, as these pups get bigger, their size gets smaller because there's only so much that mom's transferring. The other characteristics that I think are important to be familiar with are this endogenous store of mineral that can be mobilized. So, trained mothers describe the relationship between body mass and skeletal mass across mammals. This is a log-log relationship, and they found that this scaled at 1.09. So when we add or estimate the skeletal mass for a few different species, we can look at a 40-gram mouse and find that its skeletal mass is estimated at less than low and small species, as well as bone loss may be substantial. And this is important for females because it could impact biomechanics and the risk of fracture. And I think the other neat thing about studying bone and calcium is that it's quite tractable. You know, relative to energy, energy occurs in a lot of different tissues. It's stored in different places in the body. And 99% of the body's calcium is in the skeleton, so it makes it really easy to keep track of this resource. Okay, so the next work I'm going to describe was completed by one of my other PhD students, Christina Schmidt. And she was interested in calcium intake and its impacts on reproductive performance. And this work, we worked on the white-footed mouse. This species is common throughout the eastern two-thirds of the U.S. And one of the reasons that we selected this species is we wanted to work on animals that are relatively large litter size, but we also wanted our data to have some ecological relevance. And we know that wild rodents may be limited by calcium at various points in their lives, and that's evident because we know wild rodents oftentimes are augmenting their intake by gnawing on shed antlers and bone and such that they might not know. Okay. So there's a possibility that they have calcium deficits in the wild, and the other nice thing is that we can keep these guys in captivity, so we can carefully control their diet and monitor reproductive outcome. Okay, so the overarching question that Christina was interested in is whether or not dietary calcium intake influences the reproductive performance of mothers, specifically looking at effects on sex ratio. I'll explain that. We were interested in whether or not calcium intake influences the amount of mineral that's being allocated to the litter. And finally, we were wondering if low calcium would be associated with reduced litter size. Okay. And once again, we needed a little bit of background data before we got started with these bigger questions. First, it was really important to us to know that low calcium intake was costly for mothers. And so we wanted to know, are they losing bone during lactation? We know other animals are, but we need to confirm that. And we looked at it both during a reproductive bout, and we were also interested in whether or not there were sustained effects on the skeleton between reproductive bouts. Because it's that time between reproduction that's going to affect when you're going to, if you're going to reproduce again. Okay. So we used a few different methods that I'll tell you a little bit about. So first we have an in vivo method that we use called DEXA. DEXA is a method of looking at bone mineral density. It's an in vivo technique. It's the same instrument that's used to look at bone mineral density in humans, but of course we're working at a slightly different scale here. And then we also use an ex vivo method, which is microcomputed tomography. And if you aren't familiar with this technique, I think it's a really neat one. You take an intact bone and you put it in the instrument and it rotates around the bone. It takes hundreds of images and interdigitizes them and gives you a lot of detail about the three-dimensional structure of that bone. So you get information about the trabeculae. Those are the struts within the bone that give it extra strength. And you can also get information about the cortical bone, so that's which is occurring in the mid-shaft. Okay? And I love seeing visuals of things. So one of the cool things here, this is a lactating lab mouse, and you can see a thinning of the trabecular bone here, and some breakage associated with lactation as well. Okay, so this first data is using DEXA. So we kept animals on a low calcium diet, or what we call a standard calcium diet, that which is normally given to rodents in captivity. So we have standard in dark blue and low in bright blue, and I'll just focus in here on mid-lactation. We did see that when animals had a lower calcium intake, they were losing more bone during lactation. So we looked at the long bones of tibia, as well as the femur here, as well as the lumbar vertebrae, and actually they're losing more from the lumbar vertebrae than they are from the long bones. And then we looked at between reproductive bouts. Actually, laboratory animals, it's been shown that they're extremely good at recovering following lactation. But in this case, actually our most likely to mate. Whereas females tend to mate regardless of their body condition. So if you are a good conditioned mother, then and you can produce a high quality male, then you just might hit the fitness jackpot. But if you can't, and you're in poor body condition, a safe bet is having daughters. They're likely. Okay, so we looked at how calcium intake impacted sex ratio. Animals on our standard calcium diet had the predicted 50-50 sex ratio, and animals on our low calcium diet produced more than 75% female offspring. So we were really excited about these results. There's pretty good support for traverse in bird studies, far fewer in mammals, and rarely something with this degree of askew. So he clearly seemed to have some support for traversability with regard to calcium availability. So one should suspect if we have a sex ratio skew towards females, then when females on a low calcium diet, they should have lower quality young. And we find just that. So some of the variables we looked at here, we looked at the mass of the femurs. We did the same thing for the humerus and had the same results. The overall mass of the femurs was reduced when they had low calcium, mothers on low calcium. And that was associated with a reduction, actually is different, reduction in width rather than length. When we looked at the percent calcium and phosphorus, it was not different between groups, so they were guarding that. But nevertheless, if you looked at the total amount of calcium or phosphorus that were accumulated in the tissues, it's reduced when the bone gets less. But there was no effect on sex ratio. So mothers weren't trying to bring that body composition up and they're going to start producing much. Okay, so we think that these results have some important implications for areas where there's less calcium availability. We certainly know that variation in soil calcium occurs in different regions, and infotonic disturbances can also affect the availability of calcium as well. So next I'd like to describe a couple studies I did with lots of undergraduates at Auburn, looking at what factors might contribute to how much bone mothers lose during lactation. So the first one I'd like to address is there a limit to the amount of bone that mothers will lose during reproduction? And so one would expect, as a greater demand is placed on the mother, and certainly a greater litter size is a greater demand, that at the end of lactation, you would have reduced bone mineral, that you'd have a negative relationship. But I reasoned if you have a species that has repeated reproduction, that there must be some mechanisms in place that keep mothers from investing to the point of system failure. So I predicted that if we looked at the amount of residual bone relative to maternal demand, that ultimately we see this plateau at a level where the risk to the mother remain relatively low. So I did this work in the laboratory mouse, and specifically the ICR strain. And there were several reasons for selecting ICR mice. First off, they're known for being really good mothers, which was handy because I'm manipulating the litter sizes and doing cross-fostering. And they're also known for having quite large litters. Okay? So on the day of birth, I manipulated litter size to 3, 8, 30, factors which govern the loss of bone. It's this last study where we looked at the mechanical stress in bone loss. And so this paper, for me, was inspired by one particular paper. So in this study, they had looked at bone loss during lactation in rats. And the handsome animal was on a low-calcium diet. Now, reading this paper, and mothers lost 50% of the mineral from their femurs while they were lactating. And as an ecologist by training, I looked at that and thought, that animal would never survive in the wild. And so I wondered if it wasn't just a function of being in a little tiny box and not having any stress on their skeleton. I mean, we've all been told at some point that exercise is good for keeping your bones and being high and so forth. So, I predicted that when mothers had greater stress on their skeleton, that they would lose less mineral. And it was one of these things, I came up with this study, I was really excited, we were about to get it started, and then I found in the literature that someone had done something pretty darn similar. This is the problem with studying mice, is there's an amazing amount of literature out there, and sometimes if you aren't using the proper search term, you don't find it. So, in this study, they had either a control animal in a standard box, or they had animals that had access to a tower. And the cool thing was, I had the same design in mind before I saw theirs. But the good thing was, is they were looking at animals during postnatal, or following postnatal growth. So they were still juveniles, and they were on their way to reaching adult size. So it was different from my design. And what they found in this study is that when animals had access to this tower, they had greater cortical thickness, and they had more trabeculae. So that stress has an effect on bone health. Okay, so here's my design, a little bit different. The water bottles at the top to stimulate climbing, and they really seem to enjoy climbing their tower. My control group was a little bit different. So there's been some recent research that suggests that energy metabolism and calcium metabolism interact. And so I wanted to make sure that energy expenditure was comparable between my groups. So I needed a way to get my animals to move around a little bit more. And so these guys had this tunnel so they could move back and forth, but they didn't have the same strain in the tunnel. As a proxy for energy metabolism, I looked at food intake and it was the same between groups. So I think I achieved my goal there. We did take video of these animals recording. I just did it overnight. If you cumulatively looked at the amount of time they were in there, it was 15 minutes a night. That prior study in the growing mice, they spent 12 minutes per night, or per day. They did the whole 24-hour period, so actually longer than I measured. So my mice were climbing a little bit longer, but also my mice were much heavier than this. So I have to expect that the strength of some of my animals was greater than this other study. So the first thing I looked at was bone composition as well as body composition. And I found no difference between my groups. I thought this study was such a sure thing. But then we looked at micro-CT data. And so first we looked at the number of trabeculae. I like this here because we can, same number of pups, and we always control for litter size. And you can see the real differences there. So the animals in the tower group, just as we would have expected, had more trabeculae. But when we looked at the cortical thickness, the animals in the tower group had reduced cortical thickness. So this was the opposite to what they found in the non-reproductive growing animals. Okay? So what I think is going on here is that these animals aren't reducing the amount of mineral that's mobilized, and this redistribution that's occurring of bone is a way of protecting the amount of mineral that's transferred to their young. Okay, so the last thing I just wanted to quickly tell you about is what we're working on now. And I don't have much data to present this week. So I became really interested. There's a wealth of data that's come out in the last 10, 20 years in the biomedical literature showing that the early developmental environment, so this is the environment both in utero and during lactation, can have real important effects on offspring physiology. So maternal nutrition has been shown to impact probability of obesity, heart disease, osteoporosis, all of these different address these questions. We are studying wild house mice, or wild derived. These mice are about 10 generations removed from mice that were living at a Cuban restaurant in Gainesville, Florida. And so a colleague of mine actually has a similar type of setup, and we got our mice from him, and he maintains them so they're outbred. And then we keep them in populations that mimic wild conditions. So we have 10 populations that are in 12 by 5 structures, and this is about the amount of space that we see them occupying in the wild. So they use a small amount of space, and we're keeping our population sizes about what we would see in the wild as well. Okay, and so here's our experimental design. There's quite a bit of data that suggests that protein intake in particular can impact the physiology of offspring. And so we literally mimic the protein intakes that have been used in a lot of biomedical studies. We have mothers and fathers as well, either on a high protein diet, 20%, or a 10% protein diet. And I think these values are ecologically relevant. So I think that wild animals would exceed that variation. It's important to me to not be crazy. There's a lot of studies in the biomedical world where they look at 45% fat intake. Wild animals are going to be like that. So we focus on protein. And in biomedical literature, it's argued. So I said that the mothers are affecting the organ development of their young. And so when offspring mothers have poor nutrition, and then the young have high nutrition, then we see all of these negative effects on obesity and heart disease and things like that. And the argument is made that that mothers program their offspring to live in a comparable environment. So when offspring have the same environment as their mothers, they should be healthier, they should be better. So it's argued that this developmental programming is adaptive. Okay? If you're an evolutionary biologist, when you hear someone saying adaptive, you want to see some fitness data. And it's just not there. Okay? So we set it up in order to look at the fitness effects of this developmental program. So we have our parents are either on the higher low protein diet, and then meaning we either keep their young on the same diet or we switch them. And so one would expect that if developmental programming is adaptive, those that are on the same diet, whether it be high or low, should have higher reproductive success than those that are the switchers. Okay. That's what we've set up. At the same time, my grad students are measuring a variety of different physiological variables because we want to see how our data compares to laboratory conditions or different. So we are looking at glucose and lipid metabolism, metabolic rate, and some measures of stress phenotype. And we're quantifying the reproductive output of the F1, so number of F2s produced. And so where we're at right now, our F1s have just started reproducing. Okay? So I don't really have any fitness data on these animals. We did, before we started maintaining our F1s to breeding age, we did, oh, there it goes. We did look at the body condition of some of the pups after 2 months. So we had animals that were gone for a month, and then they were on their own on the same diet for a month, and they switched. And we have looked at measures of organ mass. That gives you a really rough indication of what's going on physiologically. Oh, I really cut this whole thing out. Okay, so let me tell you what the graphs show. So there was no difference in body mass at 2 months of age. Don't worry about it. There's only like one slide. There was no difference in body mass. There were no differences in liver mass, and that's important for fat and glucose metabolism. But two of the things that fell out is we weighed the amount of abdominal fat, and we found that when males were on either a high or low diet, they have more body fat than those that are the switchers. That is not predicted. And when we looked at our females, that they actually were more like what you would predict. So our females that were switching, particularly the ones that go from low to high, have the most body fat. So I think the cool thing is what's going on right now is the males and females seem to be And so it'll be really interesting to see how it all pans out. So our animals are starting to breed, and you should never look at your data early, but I can tell you, try not to. So in our high protein group, the males are starting to establish their dominance. They haven't done it in the low protein group. But of 3 of the 5 populations where male dominance has been established, it's high males. And for our reproductive animals, we only have 3 females that have retained their pups for more than 2 days. The first 10,000 months of your not very good. But 2 of the 4 are the low high females. So they seem to be the ones that are starting to breed first. So, yeah.
So concerning the mechanical stress issue on the bones, that's generally the biggest challenge for the biggest terrestrial vertebrates. They've got a lot of bone, but they've got a massive amount of weight to hold up, and so they have low structural integrity. You had data for the fat content of rhino milk. Do we know anything about the calcium content for rhinos and elephants? Because they're the ones who could least afford to use it.
So there are very few species where mineral has been looked at. I can't say with confidence whether, off the top of my head, whether or not it's particularly high. Yeah, that would be really interesting to look at. Yeah, because they have the highest. So incidentally, with our ground squirrels, we looked at mineral, and they have the highest calcium milk that has been measured. So building up bone, potentially before hibernation, you do see bone loss occur during hibernation. In some species, not all. Bears have been shown not to mobilize calcium. It's a mixed story for those rodents.
In the study with the cannibalism, you said that non-kin were more likely to be...
No, there's no difference.
So there's no difference between kin and non-kin?
Yeah. Yeah, so the way we set this up, I was trying to figure out a way to make all of the animals equally stressed by having non-kin. And so 2/3 of a mother's litter was her own, and 1/3 came from another female. And so that smallest litter size, 2 were hers and 1 was from another. So we kept the ratio throughout. And we did mark the animals so that we could keep track of which ones were non-kin, and they were not differentially transformed. So we always get that question, and it's a really interesting one to